Is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's on page 991 of the Church Bibles, beginning to read chapter 22, chapter 22, verse 34. The greatest commandment. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like this. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to us this morning about safeguarding Sunday. And I'm going to be doing that today. I am going to reference the passage that Colin just read to us, but I'm also going to be doing it by referencing the book of Ruth, which we've been working through this term. But before we do that, I wonder if you recognise this picture. It was drawn in 1988, and it became famous in the early, in 1888. It became famous in the early 1900s. It's called My Wife and My Mother-in-Law, and depending on how you look at this, you might see a younger woman, or you might see an older woman. To say that this is a picture of a young woman is true. To say that this is a picture of an old woman is also true. The same picture can be seen and read in two totally different ways that are both true. And today we're going to use this as a metaphor for biblical interpretation, because the way that we come to a text and the way that we read it can influence what we read there and how we read there. And those different, those things that we pull out of the biblical text can both be true. So over the last few weeks, we have been coming to the book of Ruth with a lens of one of our church values of welcoming everyone. And that has affected the things that we've pulled out of the text and the story that we've told. And Roland and Fiona and Bill done an excellent job of doing that. Now today I'm going to come to the text of the book of Ruth with the lens of safeguarding, and that means I'm going to pull out different emphases from the text. That doesn't mean that what we've preached over the last 5 weeks has not been true or good. It just means I'm bringing something different today. Today we are going to be asking questions. What does this book tell us about safeguarding? What does it tell us about victims? What does it tell us about God, and how should we as a church respond? So, a whistle-stop tour through the book of Ruth. Our story opens, doesn't it, with Naomi and husband Elimelech, sons Mahlon and Chilion, and daughters-in-law Ruth and Orpah. And very quickly, all of the men die and leave the women by themselves. And that is our first point of concern in this story, because in a patriarchal society, a woman without a man is vulnerable. A woman without a man is invisible. So, for example, if you think about rape in ancient culture, if a woman is raped, compensation can be made against that rape, but not by the woman. Only by the man who was injured, so her father or her brother or her husband or her son. They are the injured parties in that case, and they can receive compensation because of the rape that happened to the woman. But the woman herself is of inconsequence in that scenario. It seems radically unfair to us, this way of living in a patriarchal society. But in actual fact, in ancient Near Eastern culture, it offered protections to women that they wouldn't necessarily have had. They were cared for, and the responsibility of the men that had that relationship over them, whether it was a father, a husband, a brother, or a son, it offered protections that might not necessarily have been there without it. And so our story starts with 3 women who were alone with no men. They have no protection. They are invisible in terms of how they can be treated. They are defenseless and utterly vulnerable in that society. In Ruth 1, we read this: when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people in providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there to Bethlehem. I can't help thinking that this move is also prompted by the lack of men in Naomi's life. Bethlehem is now a place that is not experiencing famine, but Bethlehem is also a place where Naomi has relations, where there are men who can spread their cloak over her and protect her. And I'm sure that that is part of the reasoning for why she returns. And so Orpah returns to her father and his household, and Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem, which is in and of itself a really perilous journey. I want you to imagine the story of the Good Samaritan and what happened. That was a particular journey on a particular road. But that is demonstrative of the way that journeying and travelling was dangerous in this period of time. And yet, they do manage to return safely to Bethlehem. That is a description of the fact that patriarchy creates a society and a context in which women are vulnerable, particularly when they don't have the covering of a man. The second safeguarding problem that we come across in this story is embodied by the harvest field and the generic danger that women faced in ancient Near Eastern culture. So Ruth and Naomi are destitute. They arrive in Bethlehem, and Naomi sends Ruth out into the harvest field to glean grain. So that means that she goes around after the harvesters and picks up anything that they've dropped, or anything that is on the sides of the fields. And if you want to imagine the nature of the harvest field, I want you to imagine the most male-dominated workplace that you can. A workplace that is chauvinistic, a workplace that is sexist, a workplace that values strength and brawn over brains. You might think, I think maybe of a modern-day warehouse. I know someone who works in warehousing and logistics, and this is how she describes that environment. You might think of the weights section at a gym. Masculine environments that value strength and domination and that attract young men. And this is the environment that we find in the harvesting field. So even though when Ruth goes to the harvest field, there are other young women there, that does not mean to say that any of those young women feel safe being in that environment. I want you to cast your mind back 6 weeks ago when I introduced the book of Ruth in the context of Judges. Ruth and Boaz might offer this little bit of light relief of people living righteously in the midst of that meta-narrative, but the narrative that is encompassing Bethlehem at this time, in fact the whole of the nation, is one of normalized violence. One where the people have walked away from the moral commandments that God has set out for them. The last story that we read in the book of Judges is of a young woman that is raped, and then her body is chopped into pieces and mailed round the nation of Israel to send a message. Normalized violence. And it's in this context that Ruth is out in the harvesting field gleaning with the other woman. In fact, our story itself tells us some of this danger when Boaz comes to the field to address his workers and he meets Ruth for the first time. He says this to her, "Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where my men are harvesting and follow along. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you." And then later, when Ruth relates this story to Naomi, Naomi says this, "It will be good for you to stay with the women and the men who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. In someone else's field, you might be harmed. Even in our beautiful love story that we find in Ruth, to find these sentences about the danger that the young women might have been in is clear that this is a common occurrence, that men might have laid their hands on the young women who were in the field with them. And even though Boaz has chosen to throw his cloak of protection over Ruth, he's told the young men not to harm her. All of those young men are autonomous young men. They actually can do anything they want. And if they were to harm Ruth, there's absolutely no consequence for that, because Ruth is not sitting under a patriarch. She's not sitting under a man. So any harm that would come to Ruth would be completely inconsequential. No one would notice. Or certainly no one would have to pay for it. She's a sitting duck out in the field. Now, as it happens, as Ruth goes through this process of gleaning, she remains safe and she returns back to Naomi. But there is a sense in this culture of an unknown danger. A danger that is always present for young women who are by themselves. I wonder how much we relate to that in our culture. The third safeguarding problem that I come across in this story is actually embodied by Naomi and by family. And this is the unrecognized danger. Naomi is the brains behind the whole of this story. It's Naomi's idea to return to Bethlehem, Naomi's idea for Ruth to glean in the fields, and Naomi's idea for Ruth to go to the threshing floor. And so in chapter 3, we have this incident where Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor. And I want to describe the threshing floor a bit more for you. I want you to imagine the male-dominated sphere of the harvest field and then just multiply that to get to the threshing floor. I want you to imagine the kind of language that might be used by young men in that environment. I want you to imagine the way that young men might talk about women in that environment. Because the threshing floor is boisterous. It is full of bravado. And in our story, it is the last day of the harvest. It's the last day of their big project of the year, the last day of their hard work and labor. These men have been working 12, 15, 18-hour days for the last 8 weeks. And now they have come to the end of that. They're done, and they will celebrate. They will kick back and relax. And they do that on the threshing floor, which is a place which is notorious for prostitution. We see this in literature outside of the biblical text. There is eating, there is drinking, there is celebrating, and there's more drinking. You imagine what Trevor might see down on West Street on a Saturday night and then multiply it, and that's what the threshing floor becomes. And Naomi chooses to send Ruth into this environment. Let me read you this passage about exactly what this looks like from the start of chapter 3. Tonight, Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. So wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying and then go there. Naomi dresses Ruth up and sends her to this place that is notorious for prostitution, and she is to wait until Boaz is drunk and asleep. Which raises questions for me about what is going on between the relationship, in the relationship between Naomi and Ruth here. I wonder whether Ruth has the power to say no to Naomi. I wonder whether Ruth feels autonomous in this situation. I wonder whether Ruth actually has any other options. I suspect she doesn't have any other options. A young woman alone in a foreign country with no one else caring for her apart from Naomi. When Ruth returns from the field for the first time, Naomi says this. She tells him the story about Boaz, and Naomi says, "Bless that man. Has he not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead? That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Naomi knows that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, and she knows that he's only one of them and not the closest one. Which raises a question for me about why, when Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, she doesn't just go to Boaz and say, or to who the other men are, "You're my redeemer, so redeem me." Like it's written in the law, she had every right to do that. We see in other contexts in the Bible, for example, where we have Tamar and Jacob, Tamar just goes to Jacob and says, "I need redeeming. You need to make sure that one of your sons redeems me." That would have been normal. And yet, Naomi chooses not to do that. She chooses to put Ruth into these situations of risk and vulnerability and danger. Sometimes, our biggest safeguarding dangers can come from the people that we least expect them to come from. They can come from, actually, the people who are meant to care for us, the people who are meant to love us, and the people who are meant to keep us safe. Family relations can be an unrecognized danger. And that is as true today as it ever was back here in the Old Testament. Our fourth safeguarding danger that we're going to move on to then is embodied by this threshing floor experience. And I'm going to read bits of this story, starting in chapter 3. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly and uncovered his feet and lay down. He wakes up and she says, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're my guardian redeemer." He responds and includes by saying, "I will do for you all that you ask. Lie here until the morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, because he had said, "No one must know that a woman has come to the threshing floor." There are multiple levels of interpretation that we can do on this passage. We can do a literal interpretation. Maybe Ruth literally uncovered Boaz's feet, and he literally woke up in the night and he just spread his cloak over her to keep her warm, and then she went home the next day. That would be a perfectly acceptable interpretation of this text. That's the interpretation that Fee gave us a couple of weeks ago, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I was really pleased that Fee brought that to us. But even every theologian and biblical scholar that looks at this text would not deny that feet is an innuendo for genitals. Even the ones that would present that nothing happened on the threshing floor wouldn't deny that feet is an innuendo for genitals. So then we have like a mid-level interpretation. I read this one by a guy called Marty Solomon, who's an American theologian. And he would take a midway interpretation to this. He would say that Ruth uncovers Boaz's genitals and then lays at his feet. And when Boaz wakes up and he looks at Ruth, he looks at her over his genitals, over his circumcision, over the sign of the covenant law between him and his people and God. And that acts as a reminder for him that he has a responsibility for redeeming Ruth. That is like a midway interpretation of what happens here. Personally, I think that Boaz has sex with Ruth on the threshing floor. And that's based upon a number of factors that we see both within and without of the text. It's based on my understanding of men who are drunk and who have been partying hard. It is based on my understanding of what happens to women on the threshing floor based on other evidence outside of the biblical text. It's based on the secrecy that Boaz insists on. No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. Get up before it's light and before anyone can see you. Clearly he has in mind that there's something wrong in this situation. It's based upon this manipulation that we see from Naomi. Why doesn't Naomi approach Boaz in public? Why not just speak to him at the city gate when the other elders are present? Why is she forcing Boaz into this situation on the threshing floor? It's based upon references at the end of the book to Rachel and Leah. Think back to Leah, who trapped Jacob into marriage by having sex with him, unknown to him. He thought he was having sex with Rachel. And based upon references at the end of the book to Tamar and Judah and Perez. Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute to have sex with Judah when he refused to redeem her. And the fruit of that union was Perez. All of this comes together for me to imply for me that they do end up having sex on the threshing floor. Ruth prostitutes herself to Boaz on the threshing floor to secure her future. And in that reading, you have these 6 measures of barley that Boaz gives to Ruth to take home to Naomi, which becomes a metaphor for the seed that Boaz has given to Ruth in that act of intercourse. Now, why do I think it's important to talk about these things? Why do I think it's important to offer this kind of interpretation to the biblical text? I think it's important because it's important that we recognize that this is not a sanitized text. It's not so holy that it doesn't deal with the awfulness of life that we come across today and that we have come across all through history. And it's important because we can learn from it how God feels about these things and what we ought to be doing to respond. And first, I want us to talk about victims. Ruth is in the harvest field and is on the threshing floor because she has to be there. She has no other options. She has no other way to earn money or to buy food or to survive, to support Naomi. We look at a modern equivalent of prostitution, and women are forced there because they have no other options. We look at other stories in the text, like Leah and Tamar, that we've already touched on. These are women who have no power. The only power that they have is in their bodies and in their sexuality. A sexuality which men would like to box in and tell them how they have to use it. And yet, they can use the power that they have to try and put some influence and sway on how their lives are working out. All 3 of these women use the power that they have in their bodies to try and protect their future and to force the hands of the men around them to behave in the way, actually, that the Lord has already commanded them to behave, but they're not doing. All of these women are victims. They are powerless women who use what little power they have to try and influence their lives. And throughout history, we have condemned them as prostitutes. But that's not the condemnation that I see from God, actually. I don't ever see God in the text condemning these women for the way that they've behaved. And it is so easy for us, even then, to put this into history or to put this into something that happens where we are not. And so I want to invite Carol up because Carol's going to share a story with us just to help us make this a little bit more real and a little bit less academic.
I'd like to share with you today and the family that I encountered. I've changed their names of all of those involved. Miriam was sold by her family to a man she had to marry. He was physically and emotionally abusive. When he tired of her, he put her to work in the sex industry. The abuse at the hands of these men was extreme. She was no longer an individual. She was now a commodity, a source of income. Miriam became pregnant. She thought this would make her husband leave her, but no. He used her daughter to exert more control as he threatened to allow men to abuse her child. There was one man that he said would help Miriam to escape, but at what cost? Would her life be worse with him? What would he expect from her once he had freed her? What if her husband found her? She would only go with him if she could take her daughter. Plans were made, and she was able to escape with her daughter. Escape meant travelling in the back of a lorry with her daughter, not knowing what country they would end up in. Miriam was put to work again, but this time in pop-up brothels throughout a major city in the UK. She was working in a brothel that was raided by the police. Miriam and her daughter were put in a place of safety. This is where I met the both of them, traumatized both emotionally and physically, fearful that they would be found, and Miriam was pregnant. Miriam and her daughter were supported with accessing health services, housing, and education as they sought safety and asylum. The time came for Miriam to have her scan. She'd not had any antenatal care in her previous pregnancy. Her daughter accompanied her. This appointment was incredibly important to them both. As the scan progressed, the baby was deemed healthy, and the due date was given to Miriam. The sex of the baby was then given to Miriam at her request. She was having a girl. Miriam and her daughter were devastated. What good was a girl? A girl was no good. Why? Why? Because if she had a son, he would protect his sister. Who would protect her now? All the men Miriam had encountered, including her family, had abused her. They had used her sexuality for their financial gain, with no regard for her as a human being, a child of God made in his image.
Thank you, Carol. Don't believe the distance that you would put between yourself and people who suffer abuse. Don't believe that this is something that happens in a different time or in a different place. Don't believe that we don't live in a patriarchal society anymore. There are victims of sexual abuse who are a part of our congregation. I have spoken to them and heard some of their stories. There are victims of domestic abuse, living as part of our congregation. I've spoken to some of them. There are victims of church and clerical abuse in this church. I've spoken to some of them. Do not believe that safeguarding is not a thing that affects us, and that is why we take it seriously. So I wonder where God is in all of this. I wonder how God feels about the way these women are treated, the way they've acted when they've been trying to exact a tiny amount of power over their own lives. God does not condemn these women. Even though their sexual activities fell outside of what God's law is, he still doesn't condemn them for taking that bit of power. And he doesn't certainly condone their abusers. Rather, God sees them and God hears them and God redeems them. I wonder if you remember that story of Hagar. Hagar is prostituted by Sarah to her husband Abraham, and then has a child and is then kicked out for something that was never her fault. And God comes to her and God says this, you are pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You will name him Ishmael. Ishmael, that means the God who hears me. And Hagar replies, you are the God who sees me. So God sees and God hears and God also redeems. Look at Ruth, at Leah, at Tamar. All of these women are brought into God's story, are put into his word for us to receive. Brought into his history and incorporated into the genealogy of Jesus, the one who redeems and restores everything. These women appear in redemptive history. The very first women that we hear of in the book of Matthew are all women whose history contains disturbing sexual episodes. God does not reject these people. He calls them into his story and he holds them firmly and closely to him. And so if God is not condoning, if God is not condemning these women, how do we respond? Well, we heard from Colin a text earlier, the greatest commandment as recorded by Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor. Care for them. Protect them. Safeguard them. The UK Care Quality Commission defines safeguarding as this. Safeguarding means protecting people's health, well-being and human rights, enabling them to live free from harm and abuse and neglect. This is not a passive call. This is an active activity for us. We care and we put in place structures to prevent harm happening and to identify harm when it is happening so that we can step in and help. And so that is why I'm really proud of the level of safeguarding that we experience here at St. Luke's Church. It is gold standard, and we're not going to apologise for that. We use a charity to run all of our safeguarding processes through. They're called 31:8. The reason they're called 31:8 is because of this quote from Proverbs 31:8. It says this: speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. That is the call of the church. That's our call. And it's our call to care for and to help in that story of redemption for people who we have not been able to care for. So that's all I have to say. We're going to pray. Let's stand together.